I'm joined by lgbtqia. He is a trans community member and also professor at Ashoka University. Thank you, lgbtqia, for joining us. My first question to you is, Garima Grehs, which is a sub-scheme of government's pilot scheme SMILE, is almost on the verge of collapse. The Garima Grehs across the country is not receiving government funds for the last 18 months. What is your assessment about the scheme?
Well, unfortunately, this is part of a trend that we've seen with multiple governments of paying lip service to the trans community and not actually following through in terms of fiscal commitment so that the scheme is actually reliable. For many years, trans people running away from their homes had absolutely no government support, right? They were staying in the homes of other anybody whom they happen to find, activists, etc. And most people don't have connections with the community when they run away from home. There needs to be a well-advertised government shelter and a safe shelter, which of course the Garima Grehs have also not been safe. There have been multiple incidents of violence by family members upon people who are seeking shelter in the Garima Grehs. I mean, that's where people are running away from abusive, violent families or families who are forcing them to conform to the gender that the families have assigned trans people at birth. So, this is just irresponsible behavior on the part of the government.
We have learned that various heads of Garima Grehs have tried to communicate with the government, yet they have not received any response from the government side. What does it say about government's accountability towards the community?
Well, the government's accountability towards the trans community has always been very low, but the government's accountability towards much larger groups of people has also been very, very low. You had a farmers' protest on the road for a year before the government listened, right? And that was one of the largest marginalized communities in this country with a lot of social legitimacy, with a lot of people, with a majority of people really backing them. So we don't necessarily expect a lot better from a government that is not used to listening to people, or that thinks that in its arrogance that it can just get away with, not listening to people by just fomenting communal tensions before each election.
As you said, when trans community members move out from their home, they do not have much communication back with their family. So if the Garima Grehs does not work properly and if it collapses, how difficult will it be for trans people to move forward?
Trans community, has a long history of managing by connections with one another and, with no dependence on the government whatsoever. So we will survive it. But as I said, survival depends on whom you find from the community. And not everyone who is struggling as an isolated trans person and running away from home is going to find another trans person, or going to find another trans person who is supportive and not struggling themselves. So, the problem really is that every person should have a relationship with the government, even if they don't have a relationship with the other individuals whom they may or may not have found. And a lot of that in turn depends on access to the internet, right? The kinds of things that also further depend on the pre-existing privileges of caste, class, and network that people have. So people will manage, but certainly they will be worse off. And there are certainly several individuals who have been depending on the Garima Grehs who will essentially be dispossessed of a home. And so it will have real consequences for the people who've depended on the Garima Grehs system so far.
So what do you think, what should the government do to ensure safer environment and safer shelter home for trans community members?
Also, certainly one thing that the government should do is to ensure that there are paid security personnel at each of the Garima Grehs. These can be trans people because trans people, again, need jobs, right? But people with the mandate and the government, so it could also be, regular police checks. It could be an understanding that if a call comes from the Garima Grehs, that there is a clear identified source of police protection. It could be both of these things. All of the various measures that any member of the government would put in place if their family members were at risk, they should be considering those measures for ensuring that the Garima Grehs is a safe place.
So,
I think that's the kind of training that the security in question need to have, which is that in general, the police, think that people don't need security from their natal families, right? They think that it is their job to just arrange these. In fact, they often think it's their job to reunite children, or even if they're adult children of abusive families with those families. They think their job is to restore the custody of the family rather than to ensure a separation from a violent and abusive family. That training needs to be put in place.
So you have said many points. So what can be the way forward? Like, is there a need to be a sensitization among police when it comes to taking care of transgender community?
No, certainly that sensitization is needed, but also police will bring their lived experience into this, right? And so if the police largely consist of men who are used to being the kinds of people, the patriarchs in their family setup, who would probably behave in exactly the same way as these abusive families, if their kids were to come out to them as trans, then we can't expect them to be protective towards trans people who approach them for help. So the composition of who's in the police, are trans people in the police? Are there women police officers? Is there a special helpline set up for some of these things? And even if they are women, the real question is, are these the kinds of people who, if this were to happen in their family, would be understanding and supportive of trans children? So that certainly that has to be put in place, both as a sensitization module, but also one has to think about the composition of police, the role police plays in wider society, right? Are police largely protectors of those who are marginalized and dispossessed, or are they largely acting on the behalf of those who have money? Are cases generally settled based on who has money, or are cases generally settled based on who has a just claim for a need for security or a need for protection? We already know that the police act in favor of those who are marginalized and dispossessed in general. So there's a wider problem beyond what the trans community faces.
Okay. So as of now, as far as the Garima Grehs scheme is concerned, what are the shortcomings of the scheme, if you can briefly state?
Of the scheme itself?
Yeah.
There are often limitations on the conditions in which trans people approach the shelter. So for example, many of these shelters don't take on couples, despite the fact that many people, when they run away as couples. That's a shortcoming. The government always wants to support individuals, but never ever wants to support couples in love, whether they are intercaste couples or interreligious couples or trans and queer couples. So, and of course, they may be not just couples, but triples, or just groups of people who are running away from home together. That support structure needs to be put in place, and understanding needs to be put in place about that. The funding commitment for this needs to be long-term. It cannot be short-term. And the standard modus operandi of the government with all of these Garima Grehs has been to hand them over to NGOs temporarily to run them, whereas it is essential for the government to run these shelters themselves. Why does the government always run away from doing its job and foist them on to non-governmental actors? So, the government should be running these shelters. They should be employing trans people in regular government jobs to run these shelters. That is the government's responsibility. We expect the government to act for the people directly and not to be intermediated through private agencies.
Okay. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Bittu for joining us. Thank you.